All right, but then I think we can start. Thanks, everyone. Welcome. My name is Antonio Schettino, and I'm Senior Advisor Open Science at Erasmus Research Services. I apologize in advance. I'm very tired because my cat woke me up, and I could not fall asleep anymore. So if I say something, a bit crazy, a bit stupid, blame my cat. Don't blame me, of course. Okay, so first of all, I would like to welcome the panel members here. I'm just gonna briefly introduce them to you. So the first person that I would like to introduce is Dr. Saran Field, who is our external guest. Saran defines herself as a meta-scientist. She obtained her PhD in behavioral sciences in Groningen, and is now a postdoctoral researcher at CBTS, which is the Center for Science and Technology Studies at Leiden University. Her current research focuses on scientific reform, what constitutes responsible research practices across disciplines, and how to establish a community revolving around these practices. Alongside this, she is passionate about introducing reflexivity to quantitative science, working out how to best select a replication target, and interrogating scientific reform practices and anticipating their downstream consequences. She uses mixed, sometimes digital methods to explore the scientific problems that she finds interesting. So, Saran, this is Saran.
Hi.
Applause for Saran. The second person in the panel is Dr. Anastasia Sergeeva. Do I pronounce it correctly?
No.
Okay. Help me?
Sergeeva.
Anastasia is assistant professor in the Department of Organization and Personnel Management at the Rotterdam School of Management. In her research, she explores value-laden aspects of innovating and organizing, as well as the reasoning processes underlying the generation of novelty, both in business and in science. She is also interested in developing and legitimating novel research programs in the field of management. Her research and theorizing are philosophically supported by American pragmatism, and her empirical work, she mostly uses qualitative research methods. So again, a round of applause for Anastasia Sergeeva.
Oh, I started it. I cannot stop it anymore.
Then we have Dan Peters. Dan is an organizational theorist who researches and helps set up spaces for organizing around grand challenges. Since 2019, he's been involved in different spaces and networks dedicated to advancing the balanced transition of the Dutch agri-food system. His PhD research on value-based organizing at the Rotterdam School of Management aims to shed light on what happens when you put the whole system in a room where different actors discuss the challenges and seek to work towards potential solutions together. Conceptually, he draws on bodies of work in grand challenges, interstitial spaces, issue frames, and framing, paradoxes, and future making. So thanks, Dan, also. Last but not least,
We're there.
Maria Carmen Punzi. She's a menstrual health researcher and activist.
There you go.
Since 2017, she has worked to build bridges between the for-profit, the non-profit, and the academic world, gathering evidence on the connections between menstrual health, sexual and reproductive health, and gender equity. Her PhD research at the Rotterdam School of Management focuses on menstrual health and social enterprises. She argues that menstrual health affects women's opportunities, health, and inclusive participation in society, and yet the topic is widely missing in current agendas around gender equity. In 2021, she co-led an initiative to advocate for free menstrual products on the Erasmus University campus, and now continues her activism within and beyond the university.
There you go.
So,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have around 90 minutes. The idea is that we start conversations among the panelists, but then there is room for discussion. If the audience has any questions, please raise your hand, and I will come downstairs and give you the microphone. We had like a couple of chats all together, and we thought that maybe the best idea would be to start by giving a broad definition of open science, or maybe if I can rephrase, when you hear the words open science, what do you think about? And maybe Saran, would you like to start?
Yeah, so when I think about open science, I think about it as being part of a bigger network of research elements. So transparency, openness, Data sharing, for example, for those of you who are more quantitative, for qualitative researchers, you might think more of reflexivity and being open with discussing your methods and your role in the research process. That's one element of what I just would call good science. So sharing, openness, it's one element of responsibility of good science. But we have a lot of other different elements that kind of round out good science. So for me, openness is one part in a bigger puzzle.
Yeah. Thank you. Maria Carmen, if you...
Yeah, just to add 2 words, I think collaboration, or 3 actually. Collaboration, accountability, and impact. Collaboration, because I think it's hard to do open science alone. And so both in sharing practices, but also learning from each other, I think collaboration is key. Accountability, because clearly it asks us to not only be transparent, but also be conscious of what we do at each step, because we want to share with others. And I think impact, and we'll talk about that more later, because I think that there is a real opportunity to have more impact on organizations with our science if we do it in a way that is actually understandable. I think open science can help with that.
Okay, thank you. Dan, would you like to say something?
Yeah, of course. I think for me, when I think about open science, it kind of goes back to my undergraduate days where I was studying economics and statistics, and there it was very prevalent. Then when I made the switch towards qualitative research, it reverberated also with a sense of frustration, like how am I supposed to do this? But I think the principles and practices of open science are geared towards helping us move towards a more systemic body of knowledge, and provides us principles and practices to do that. So I see it more as like an ambition to a certain extent. Yeah.
Thank you. Last but not least, Anastasia.
Well, actually, when I hear open science, I think about a set of good insights, good ideas, good values, which are individually not controversial at all, and I guess most of people working in academia either share or must pretend to share. But at the same time, when I hear that, this bundle of values is given a certain name, which kind of, open science framework, open science reform, I immediately start fearing that it can become an ideology, it can get... it can rectify these positive, unambiguously good values into practices which will become like an iron cage for researchers, which will diminish the space for creativity that they have. So I guess I'm afraid, where these good ideas can lead if they become like a powerful ideology, rectified and as strict practices which are imposed and coerced.
Thank you. Thank you for providing this, also this perspective, because I think it's very important. Okay, so as an idea, now, we have established more or less what open science means for the panelists. So the second question that we come up with comes from the fact that sometimes there is the feeling that open science reforms and practices originating from quantitative fields are attempted to be somehow shoehorned in qualitative fields. This, refers back to what Anastasia just finished talking about. And this can obviously cause some resistance. So for example, public data sharing is not always possible, and in other situations when we talk about replicability in quantitative sciences, the concept itself might not be plausible in some disciplines. So is this also your experience, and do you agree with this idea that maybe there are some people or some forms of open science that try to shoehorn quantitative solutions to qualitative problems? Maybe Saran?
Yeah, sure. So my first thought when I consider this, a lot of people in what I've studied as being the open science or the science reform movement, they focus very much on the practices. So again, coming back to data sharing, right? Putting your data on, say, the open science framework, uploading the metadata, the variable names and that kind of thing. That's very clearly a very quantitative open science practice. And this is coming back a little bit to your first question too, what open science actually is. For me, a lot of the time what's missing with that kind of very practice-focused perspective is an emphasis on the spirit of open science. So that spirit of transparency, of sharing, of wanting to do good science. I think that's often really missed. So that happens when we look at, directly transferring quantitative open science practices to qualitative. We miss that spirit and we focus on the practices. That direct translation doesn't quite work. How do we share qualitative data? We certainly can't after we've signed the ethics approval forms, can we? And so I think it should very much be focused on the spirit of sharing and honesty, accountability, like you said before. And so that's sort of my first thought when I think of, I'm coming from a background of both qualitative and quantitative perspectives. I was trained in quantitative, but I've come to qualitative with especially my PhD. And that's always my first thought, is that people just completely miss what the whole point of, for me, open science is. And again, that's transparency, honesty, accountability, and just opening yourself up and being open about your role in the process.
Yeah. Okay. Dan, what is your perspective?
Yeah, I think I'd like most to build on what was just shared, because I think from all the people that are sitting here, I have the least experience, but I am engaging a lot with practitioners in the field. I'm conducting interviews. I'm really situated in particular networks, and I talk to people and that open up and are very vulnerable. But when we're talking about, sharing and being in the spirit of openness and transparency, I'm always kind of asking the question, like, to whom are we doing this? Because if we publish a paper, we try to give people the benefit of the hindsight, right? Like, we're not walking them through all the different iterations that we've done to eventually come to some type of theoretical understanding or conceptual model. That would be like, that it would just take way too much time. And also then if I have to explain to a practitioner in the field, like, this is the different steps that I've gone through, I think I've lost them halfway already. So my question really becomes like, if to whom are we then sharing and being transparent? Is that just researchers as a community? Is it to our peers? Is it to the people in the field if we want to generate impact? And then also the question really becomes, like, what do we then share? Because I think I can give them my full data repository and they'll be overwhelmed, because I am too. Then we also need to create memos and different notes that walk them through the different data sets and help them synthesize it. But, in the end, I think I think there are some counterproductive mechanisms that may come into play. That's what I want to emphasize, yeah.
Yeah. Nice, thanks. Anastasia?
Yeah, I guess I want to build on what Dan just said. First of all, I think when we are discussing how the principles of open science and the practices of open science can be applied in qualitative research, we should start with understanding that qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, belongs predominantly to the logic of discovery, whereas quantitative research belongs to logic of justification. And we know that we really don't know how the discovery happens. So it is the main thing why we need qualitative research is to kind of look at surprising things in the world and then try to come up with explanations for those things, and based on those explanations build theories to understand the world. This process of how do we come up with that explanation that then yield a theory which becomes, let's say, fruitful and useful for practitioners and influential within academia, we can't really explain that creative leaps which is made. And even when we present qualitative research, there exists the underdetermination of theory by evidence, like two researchers looking at the same data will think different theoretical categories in their head based on their backgrounds and perspectives. And so there is, even when we write qualitative, the paper based on the qualitative research, we want readers to take a creative leap together with us as the authors. So we must be persuasive for that, of course. So there are a lot of people doubting our research. That's how the system is set up with reviewers and editors and stuff. But ultimately, I feel like that in this, because discovery is so central for qualitative research, there is something most important that we can't share anyway. Yeah, and then of course we can talk about the practices which help to share this or that, and maybe if it's possible, make the data public. Maybe if it's possible, put this extra effort into guiding the reader through by adding memos, etc. But we should be mindful that this extra work just that it has some purpose and not just a ceremony that, oh, we did something for the sake of open science. No one cares, it's not really important what we did, but we also spent a lot of time which could have been spent much more productively.
Can I just add something there?
Yes, of course.
I completely agree. As someone who's come into qualitative research, I see exactly what you mean. You do have to kind of ask the reader to come with you on some of these leaps you make. I just wanted to say, for again, especially for people who are listening who are qualitative researchers also, this is why I would consider reflexivity and positionality as being forms of open science that we can actually engage in, because they help when you share yourself, when you kind of elucidate that role of yourself as a researcher in the research process. That kind of gives people a bit of context to walk through with you on those creative leaps that they end up having to make with you. And so I would say that that's one way that we can help the reader along, is by also sharing that, that positionality, our relationship to the research as the researcher. Because again, when you're dealing with humans that are doing research into other human beings, you're dealing with a really tricky double hermeneutic, right? You're dealing with the biggest conflict of interest that you could probably be dealing with. And so to be able to share yourself and to say, this is where I sit in relation to my subject, in relationship to my role, that allows the reader to come with us a little bit further and helps elucidate that process. It's not a panacea. It doesn't fix everything. But it is a tool that we can use as one of the tools in the open science toolbox to help us get there a little bit better.
I fully agree with the importance of reflexivity and positionality in the research. I just think that these are things which are just allocated within a paper. It's within how I write the paper for people. And if then I'm later asked to kind of give a report how I contributed to open science, let's say if these things become imposed on us in the university, by the university or by the department, then my answer would be, well, go read my paper, I did my best to demonstrate my reflexivity there. Like, it just sounds, stupid. So it seems like I have to be doing, it seems that for complying with open science, I have to be doing something extra. And what you are saying, it's not really extra, it's within a paper, it's within a well-written paper.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm losing this. Like, why do we need to say open science reform? Why do we need to say that this is some special separate thing when it just should be in our papers if they are well written?
It should be, but it's not.
Yeah.
And that's the issue, right? Like by making this into a thing, we re-interject that this needs to be just part of the regular, open science, just science done right. Thanks, John Tennant, for making that a sticker. But, I think you're exactly right in that in making this into a word, making this into a whole research MO, we're basically saying, no, this is how you do research. The old way of doing things, that wasn't quite right. How about we consider how we can do it right now? So I completely agree, basically.
Yeah. Maria Carmen, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, it's just something a bit provocative, if I may.
Yes.
I think there's an element of gatekeeping, right? So I think I think researchers, and especially people within academia, have such a hard time and a hard road to get where they are. And to be asked to say, how do we do these creative leaps, is to give up power. That's the power, that's why you got there. I mean, let's have that conversation. Because if I make it intelligible for people that are not in academia, what makes me better? I mean, and it's hard, and it's a hard conversation to have, because I think this is actually the problem. When you are asked to give up power, and I'm not saying that we have the power, but it's a co-constructed power, that's the problem. How do you make that leap? That's scary. I think that's scary also because people work very hard. Like the majority of people, I would say, in academia have worked very hard to get where they are. And so I think that there's a little bit of the sharing the data. I think there's a lot of how far can you go in lying about your data set? So what kind of practices can we put in place so that we avoid you lying about your data set? But I think that's really not the problem. The problem is, indeed, how much do we want to give away of the magic of that conceptual leap? And what are the consequences of that? Because, consultants already run with the articles that we publish and they get paid 15 times as much as us with the results. This is happening. So if we also give away the process...
Yeah, I think this ties in with something that we're going to discuss later, which is the system of incentives that we might, be subject to. Before switching to the next question, I would like to know if somebody in the audience has any questions or, oh, yes. Yeah, but we're also
For
recording.
the recording.
Okay, yeah, it's George Alexandra. I'm from the finance department. It's exactly in the last point that you made. Your name?
Maria Carmen.
Maria's point. It's a valid question if someone is looking from the perspective of the researcher, giving up the methods, the data, the process, gives potential power to others. But this is a legitimate question and concern of all new researchers. What I have seen in my probably a little bit longer experience is that the more you get, the more you give, the more you get. And if everyone embrace that, we will be all better off. You know, we give and we have all gone through this, myself included. I've seen all of us struggling and agonizing about having our ideas, process, and innovations stolen. But the more I give, I see, the more I get back. So I think that we should pass the message to open everyone, that everyone can benefit out of this process much more by giving more, by being open.
And I kind of agree. I brought up the provocative point because I think that if we want to have an honest conversation, we also have to go there. But I do think that that's the idea of the community of science. If you give, you also get. Ideally, I think.
And thanks for your provocative angle, because otherwise we wouldn't have had that very important comment. So,
but can I add here? I think it's also depends where we think it is important to give more, right? I think the answer to the whole problem of how we make papers more reflexive, how we make researchers more honest, etc., and more accountable and more responsible in their research. I think that the answer is in education. It's in education that we should instill those values of the profession. Maybe we need to be more vocal about values of our profession. And now it's kind of taken for granted. And of course, well, what is science here for? What's the purpose of science? We don't talk about it during our PhD training, during our Master of Science. That's also a very high title, and but we are not talking about those things. We are more focused on methods, on how to, and PhDs, how to get papers published, how do you run your econometrics in a more sophisticated way so that you get into a more sophisticated journal. And maybe it's through the education rather than through incentives, like a softer, milder methods, you know, that and that's the context in which we have to give more, share more of our knowledge, and teach better for new generations of researchers to write better papers where this transparency and honesty is like in the papers which people read. Because I'm also afraid that while there is still some hope that someone reads our papers, there is like even less hope that someone will go and read like those extra, you know, supplementary materials we publish.
Yeah, to some extent, right? Because one could also think the other way around, right? So maybe people don't read a lot because the context maybe that is given by other scientific output is not there. I don't have a solution for that, right? But I think it's good to see it both ways. Would you also? Yeah. Let me come downstairs.
I just want to echo what you're saying, because it's really important to talk about the underlying values that we're actually promoting with these practices, and especially when we're considering the new practices that new technologies or new networks enable us to do, like enable us to create a more transparent science. We need to also think about when using these practices, why are we using them? What is the purpose for them? And not just teaching the actual practice to their students, but teaching the underlying idea of why are we using it. And also that's a way to show them how to use the practice, how to use the technology. Because if you don't understand why, then you're probably using it wrong as well. Or there's no way of prohibiting you in doing things that are even, we can consider bad for you, but even bad for science and the trust in science. And that's something that we don't touch upon yet, but it's also about our legitimacy as an institute. It's a legitimacy to the public. And we We can say the public will not read these supplements. The public will not even read the papers we write. But it's not about, never comes to reflexivity comes in place again. It's not about what we communicate to them. It's about how we think about our work and actually argue that we're doing the right thing. It's all, we need this reflexivity and we need this, these tools and these practices to show us why are we actually doing this and why do we think we're doing it the right way in order for us to communicate that to the public as well.
I think that's what I was sort of saying earlier with the spirit of open science, not focusing on the practices, because I mean, there's a bunch of theoretical work that sort of argues that if you're focusing on the practices, the reification of the values, then you're missing out on the whole participation, the whole point, right? That the spirit of open science. So indeed, when we're teaching, I think this is especially crucial, is to focus on teaching the why first, and then let the practices follow. Oh, yeah. But starting at undergrad, level, you know.
Yeah, so in case it was not recorded, the point was like not only to do it bottom up from PhD candidates or even undergraduate level, but also involving in this educational process more senior researchers. Okay, thank you. So it's a lot of fun, and we have just started. So let's go. Let's go back into the script. So I know that maybe not everybody in the panel likes this kind of structure. My apologies, Anastasia, but a bit of guidance is not that bad. So the next question that we thought about, discussing all together, refers to open science not just as a series of practices, but also as a thinking framework. And this is something that was already brought up by the panel. So this thinking framework whose intrinsic goals are to increase transparency and ensure honesty and accountability. I don't even know why we should, let's just say again what has already been said, but would you like to elaborate on something? Because this has already come up, but would you like to elaborate a bit more on this? I don't know, Saran, would you, if you have any?
Yeah, so one quick thing I'd say is to sort of look at responsible research more broadly. So I said in the opening discussion that I see open science transparency as being one element of a bigger toolbox. For me, responsible research is quite a broad, sort of all-encompassing thing that takes this thinking framework into account. Accountability, honesty, like we've already said, openness. We're looking at responsibility in research. So it's a relational thing. Who are we responsible to? As Don Peter has just said. So it's all about being responsible, in my opinion, and taking that sort of slightly broader thinking framework. Because again, I think if we focus quite too much on sort of open science, we're missing a lot of other really crucial elements for responsibility and for just good science. So that's all I would say about the thinking framework.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, there's also another reason why, one of the programs that we have, one of the strategy programs that we have at Erasmus University is open and responsible science. I think it's a very, very valid point. Anastasia, would you like to elaborate on this?
Yeah, I think that an important question becomes that how do you make people adopt this new thinking framework, perhaps new or maybe old but forgotten, and because it's much relatively easier to impose practices, to say, okay, these are the practices which you do. Like, of course, people will resist, but ultimately it's still simpler than make people that change the way they think, that change their mindset. So how do we go about it? I think that it is extremely difficult, and it probably will take a very long period of time, but I think we should start with our PhD programs, maybe even before that, the way we screen for PhD programs, right? We should screen maybe less on what people already know, let's say, about stats, so that we need to invest less in training them. But maybe we should see whether they perceive academia as vocation or not, kind of what is their purpose of joining it. And next, during our PhD programs, very few schools actually have philosophy of science classes, and we must have those, because otherwise sometimes I'm not sure when I'm talking to people, I'm not sure, like when I was doing my PhD and I had my classmates, I'm not sure people are on the same page as what science is for in principle. What is that the big, yes, you are writing your small paper, but that it is a brick in some bigger building or church or temple, I don't think that everyone has this understanding, and we should ensure that people do have. So we have to educate them on a philosophy of science. And also there was one course which I had during my PhD, and my PhD studies at IESE, and then it was removed, so now they don't have it. And I don't know any other PhD program that would have it. And the course was called, we are in the management school, so the course was called Management Classics. And so we were reading a book per week. And it was not just about getting familiarized with the theories, which is like, of course, a big part of this course, but it was just such an inspirational experience, because you read like this book by Simon, by Selznick, by Chester Bernard, and you understand, okay, this big thing, maybe you will not be able in your career to achieve that height, but at least you see what is the science for, who are really advancing it. And it was extremely, and I think these things bring us closer to the idea, okay, of what science is for, what values are the foundational values for this profession, and kind of put us closer in touch with those values. Yeah. And then it's easier to be honest and reflexive in your papers.
Very good perspective, yes. Maria Carmen?
Yeah, it's difficult, because this makes me also think there are different purposes for science, and maybe we don't all agree on what these different purposes are. And that also means that we're not structuring our studies in the same way. Because the first thing that I was thinking is, often we really, in our limitations, we are really asked to reflect on, basically to humble ourselves in front of the audience, right? But the society works in a completely different way, because it's going faster and bolder and big statements. And so there's this mismatch between what we can claim, or what we claim, and what's being asked of, I don't know, of research centers, let's say, even stepping outside of academia. So I think that there's this tension between us as academics being stricter and stricter on ourselves, the review process is becoming super long, super hard, sometimes pointless because they don't go anywhere. And then the world keeps going, and then ChatGPT or writes your paper. And so I think that that's maybe the issue I have with... Yeah. How can we become responsible while also not losing the momentum of trying to contribute to any conversation? Because if we get lost in these practices, we really lose any space to say anything. Sure. And I think and I don't think that that's what open science is asking. I think we have to rethink open science in a way to help us contribute to these conversations, without being lost in but the data sample, but I only had 15 interviews. But we always have something to say. I think, especially if we see who's talking.
Yes.
So that's my, and I think open science can support doing that, paradoxically.
Yeah.
But it's good to reflect on that tension, I think.
Yeah, maybe the tension here that you are highlighting is also the responsibility that higher education institutions have towards society. Because if their responsibility is to accept and to teach that a lot of what we know is uncertain, and then things are just on a different spectrum on the uncertainty scale, then maybe that's the contribution that higher education can really provide to society. And that might lead to slowing down and not allowing ChatGPT 8 to run a country. Anyway, Dan, sorry, I didn't mean to...
no worries. I'm just listening to the panelists. But I think a recurring theme here, I think, has to do with education, right? Like, it's how we are educated ourselves and how we're trying to educate the next generation of researchers, and also a little bit more top-down is also pretty good, because we know that these things structurate how we also think. And I think there's an important difference between education and training. I think we get excellent training here at RSM. We really learn the ropes, like how to write an introduction, how to showcase that you know how to jump through hoops and make good secret handshakes. These are the rules of the game, and we learn them by heart and through practice. But education requires a little bit more of a little bit more liberty to also explore what for you is research, what for you constitutes good conceptual leaps or qualitative inferences. So there needs to be some playing room, and I feel like if we want to explore these values, I think it's very idiosyncratic, and I think it boils down to how you as a researcher think is the best thing to do in a particular empirical context, or what conversation you want to latch onto in what way. So I see that in education and training we see like opposite incentives kind of playing out. And if you seek security and a career in academia, you need to really learn your training. But that doesn't offer you a lot of incentives and opportunities to explore what you think is best to do. I think this is like an overarching theme that I'm kind of...
Yeah, this is the elephant in the room. We're getting there.
Yeah.
Okay, unless there are comments or questions from the audience. No? Captivated by our panelists.
Don't ask.
I can ask because I'm looking at the time, so I can ask. At some point, I won't ask anymore.
Again, I had to hear my voice, but it is. Let me declare that I don't know Maria. But you don't need to share a room or to have a lot of coffees with her to appreciate her frustration, as she nicely put it earlier at some point. Oh, no, it's put it an open concern into what it appears to be placed in front of people who try to think of from this open research perspective as the next and the next and the next request that comes from wherever it can be. And we understand the reviewers and the editors, they have a purpose, and their questions and their queries are sort of legitimately posed on them because of the position. Okay, fine. But we appear that we are in a position where, obstacles come from all over the place. We feel that we should see it as a normal, which is not, I believe. And we have to ask questions. Why to have to prove this? What is the costs and benefits of doing something? Because we can invite any question, fine. But why to do something if there is no justification based on cost and benefit? Because you throw something on us, what? And then how we prove, we continue a step further. We find what we find in our research, limited as it is, take it the applications further. I cannot go and interpret from any perspective to use and to tell them what value they can take out of my research. Let them be there. If it is not valuable, let it die its death, but let it be used if someone sees a use. Don't pose less suffocating tasks beyond what we can reasonably expect. That's the frustration of people from I understand what you say.
If you think that Maria Carmen is frustrated, you should have met me in 2015.
I think we all share these frustrations, scientists. I have to say, Dan, I don't agree with you. I think there shouldn't be a difference between education and training. I understand their strategies in how getting things published. I understand that there's a certain way of writing on getting things published, but the success of getting things published should actually reflect good research. And if that is disconnected, there's something wrong with our system. And I can actually tell you there's something wrong with our system. But in any case, and actually I think what you're pointing towards, the training part, so teaching how to write an introduction and how to, that's actually the practices that we're talking about here. You're being taught only in these trainings, only the practices, and not why. There's a reason, of course, there's like why writing an introduction in a certain way, because the reader will understand you better, etc., etc. If the reader will understand you better, blah, blah, blah. But there's also, there's an instrumental way of doing it. But I think we are sometimes focusing a bit too much on, and that's where we get stuck in the status quo in our science, in our values, in how we translate these values to practices. If we only start focusing on how do we get things published, we are just actually focusing on the practices that are there and not focusing on the practices that could be there and the values that should be there. So in that sense, I think we shouldn't make a distinction. We should actually reflect on what are we training our scientists, our young scientists, or old scientists in that sense.
I don't want to mischaracterize you, but I think that you raised the point exactly because you see this.
Yeah,
this
exactly.
discrepancy.
I see the tension. Yeah.
Can I just comment something that I'm not sure I'm building on, but it's your comment that made me think about it, that all complex interventions in our world lead to hopefully intended consequences, but definitely also to unintended ones, right? And that's, I think, what I fear with open science becoming a system which is imposed, that it will change something that we don't anticipate now. It can change, and things which we do not necessarily desire. And as a related example, I want to give, and just to start talking more specifically about qualitative research, the absolutely dominant method in qualitative research is grounded theory. And grounded theory is, in essence, is labeling chunks of data. That's what the whole thing is about. You decide how big the chunks are, and then you give labels in several levels, or in one level, whatever. So that's basically there is, and initially when grounded theory became like this research innovation, which actually legitimized qualitative research, so it had really positive influence. When finally we started seeing qualitative research papers in the top journals, which are considered to be the top journals in management, and gradually now it is absolutely the dominant method, and I see how it, for example, contributes to the ultra-empiricist tendencies in the publishing process, the comments which you get from reviewers and editors and journals, like they basically, it's labeling chunks of data, so they want a label, they want a data for any label you use, they want a precise quote which will unambiguously, from the perspective of 4 people, let's say, engaged in the review process, like an editor and 3 reviewers, to persuade that, okay, this construct which you are proposing, the new one, or the new unobservable relationship you are positing, that you have a quote which will say exactly that and no one will doubt. And we can't get there. That's the whole point of discovery. That's the whole point of underdetermination theory by evidence. And in that sense, grounded theory, which was a good method, which did a lot of good things and still is capable of producing a lot of insightful discoveries, kind of contributes to the, this also happens in quant, of course, right? When we kind of can't really posit more abstract categories. Everyone wants you to measure exactly that, and then you become narrow and narrow and narrow in what you are saying. I think that also refers to the claims, the scope of claims we make, that as Maria Carmen was worried about it before. But in qual, so same open science, like this grounded theory, I can see how it will contribute possibly to this ultra-empiricist vibe, which is already there. Because now we also share data, but why? So that people can see, and then people can say, no, but that's, and we will become like really small in what we claim, because we will be afraid of disagreement. Yeah. And that what can happen is that we'll have less bold new theories. And that's a very dangerous state. I think there is a question.
Yeah. So I just perhaps just and then I'll come to you. I think it's a very valid point, but I think it's also embedded within a specific context, right? So the idea that some specific practices, no matter whether they're open science practices or other methodological practices, they are embedded within a system that rewards one thing rather than another. Yeah. So but then maybe a conversation can be, or an argument can be made that is not about the practice itself, it's about the practice embedded in a specific context. So if we only change the practice, then the risk that you mentioned, I think, is pretty obvious, and we should definitely take that into account. But while simultaneously, we're also trying to change other aspects, right? So probably that can provide a little bit more of a peace of mind. Then there is also an aspect of uncertainty, and we talked about uncertainty earlier, and I think it should be acknowledged. You are right. Sorry, let me...
I have so many thoughts going through my head, but the one I just wanted to mention was a few of the things that had just come up, I think, reinforce the point that I think Maria Carmen first made about that this education also has to address people who are more senior in their career, right? Because the decision maker, the editors of journals, those of us who are editors or reviewers, tend to be more senior. And they're the people who are driving a lot of this narrative, and particularly just day-to-day decisions around things like, if you're an editor, which reviewers am I going to ask to review on this journal, or on this paper rather? If I'm asking a reviewer, I want them to comment on the theory only, for example, not the methods. And there's just all these I feel tiny little micro changes that many of us could make, which could already change some of this discussion. But I then hope that this conversation isn't only happening between people who are doing qualitative research, but also people who are doing quantitative research and people who are theorists. And, you know, I feel like if we picked a random researcher, they could tell you probably quite a lot about the discussion of open science within quant research, but maybe very little about this discussion in qual research. So I'm glad we're even having this discussion, because hopefully it then raises it to that kind of awareness level with more people, I guess. So thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for your comment, because this was the main reason why we really did our best to create this sort of space, because very often qualitative researchers don't feel like they're part of the conversation, but there are things, there are aspects of open science that can definitely be useful to discuss and maybe to even implement on a practical level. So I think we're all happy that we're having this conversation. Hopefully it doesn't feel that it's, like too prescriptive, despite the fact that I've got a very structured line of questions. So let's go to the fourth one. Also because in line of, in light of time, I think we should, try to, go to the elephant in the room, which is the system of incentives. But let's just go slowly there, so that you get more and more tense, probably. There is another question that we discussed, in preparation for this panel discussion. There are important social aspects in the work of a researcher, and especially when working in public institutions and using public money to advance knowledge. Do you think that open science can help increase the impact of research, so that other societal actors, from NGOs or industry, or like the gemeente, can practically benefit from academic output? Maybe Maria Carmen, I think you raised this. This topic.
I raised the topic. I raised another elephant in the room. Maybe when we were talking, I said, well, I think we are protected insofar as no one reads our papers, because it means that they cannot make claims or takeaways that might harm. Actually, there's so much money that goes into projects that are then, funded by the UN or governments, and they are based on numbers and percentages and scientific evidence. And honestly, because I struggle and I exist between these worlds, I see the kind of papers that are being used by UN-funded projects. And it's there's also a huge divide there, which means that there is a lot of opportunity. Because I think we already do a lot of great science that could really serve some of the, like NGOs work, but also really institutions making big policy changes. I mean, I personally, for example, I look at menstrual health-related policy making in the Netherlands. Well, I can tell you, none of those politicians have ever read a menstrual health paper, ever. And then I'm thinking, well, what can I do with it? Because I have to use my extra hours after my workday to go and harass someone by email, saying, can I talk to you about this? Have you ever read anything? Not stuff that I published, but anything. So, but then the question is, I think if we approach this from a responsible point of view, which acknowledges the limitations, but also looks at actually the impact that you can already have with some of the qualitative insights that you already gather, I think you can make such a big difference without hiding behind numbers or huge data sets. Because the truth is that the average practitioner cannot distinguish the quality of a paper, and this is an actual problem. So there's researchers and even policymakers have research people in their teams, but we are in a bubble in that sense. And so I think that there's a gap there of like, well, we should be open and responsible and accountable, but where can we already do something with what we have? And I think that that's where open science can really help. It's tricky, but honestly, considering the practices happening right now, I think we all have something to add there, all of us. So that's the hope.
Yeah. Anastasia?
I would like to, I guess, to take a step back from what Maria Carmen was discussing. And so to start with, I think that the biggest responsibility we have to the society is to solve the problems that actually matter, so that our research addresses the questions that really matter for the public. So I'm taking a step back in a sense that I'm not looking at whether they're going to read our paper, etc. But let's assume we are trying to do the research which is relevant and is important not just for us as academic community or epistemic bubble within using certain theory, but for the broad audience. Yeah, these are really important questions. So now, any set of rules, any set of practices will increase the likelihood of a type 3 error. Type 3 error is that we are asking a wrong question, like in this case, wrong from the perspective of the society, right? That's not a relevant question, not an important. Any set of rules. So currently we have this kind of methodological presence of dominant methodological paradigms. Obviously, hypothetical deductivism makes you ask questions in a certain way. It's like it makes you engage into reductionism, right? You are already constrained by pre-existing theory. At least in the field of OT strategy, another dominant method is inductive theorizing. It also follows a certain methodological a certain logic, and that internal logic makes you to ask questions in a certain way. So all of them kind of increase the likelihood of actually committing a type 3 error, because we are starting to think from the methodological tradition we're ingrained, trained in, and also, of course, our theories, the theories we use. But here I'm talking like about something more general that we share, methodological paradigms, which kind of exceed the theories of most of the times, I think, at least in our disciplines. And I think that, again, how open science is practiced. If open science is practiced reflexively, it is done through merging training and education, where values are openly discussed and clear. That's one way when we try to change the mindset. But if it is done through imposition of practices, then it is like just another hurdle, which will make a likelihood of making type 3 error even more likely, because now I will think not just in terms of methods I'm going to use and techniques I'm going to use. Now I'm also going to think about tables I have to produce and supplements I have to publish openly. And so all of that will affect the question I ask and what I actually go out and research. So I will moderate myself because I know what are those constraints which I will face later when I have that paper, about to be published. And I have to think about it in advance, right? So that's, again, a fear.
Yeah. Okay. Dan?
Yeah, it really boils down to the question, I think, if open science is a how or if open science is a why. And What?
Why or? Can it be both?
It can be both, but I think we need to be aware of where the tensions then lie and how we should, as a community of researchers and practitioners, think around that and act around it and create structures or no structures for that matter. It is very fascinating indeed.
Saran?
Nothing more to add.
Well, that's it's not ominous. Is it ominous? No,
No, not at all ominous. No, the panelists are excellent.
Very good. Okay. No, in light of time, I'm not going to the audience. Not yet, because here's the elephant. The elephant has arrived. Finally. While we were preparing for this panel discussion, Anastasia said, why do we need a new term? Isn't open science just good science? And this is something that has been echoed by Saran, who quoted
John Tennant
and Melanie Imming, but mostly John Tennant. This is very much in line with what many open science proponents advocate. It's not disconnected from this whole idea that we're talking about open science, or maybe we should talk about science and closed science. Then the conversation quickly turns to systemic incentives. Where does the responsibility of the individual end and the responsibility of other actors begin? Think of reviewers and editors, journal publishers, but also institutions and funding agencies. So I think this is the key. When we talk about a system of incentives, where does our individual responsibility end? And what should we start demanding as researchers, as members of society, something more from our institutions, from our funding agencies, and so on. let's see. So Anastasia, maybe you have some initial thoughts?
Well, I guess based on what I said before, it is clear that I'm all up for individual responsibility here. That's, I think, that the long-term solution, the real solution. And that's not a battle which we can even win. Like in any field of human activity, there will be people who are, let's say, trying, okay, let me start from the beginning. There is a wonderful book by Hugh Heckler called On Thinking Institutionally. So it's about being located within any institution, and academia is one example of an institution. And that's about of different attitudes, and he opens up the book with the example of two players, well, some American thing, they play with the ball, and the...
Don't be too specific when it comes to sport.
So basically one person plays to score and to become famous, and one person plays for the respect of the game. And that attitude of the respect of the game, he defines it very nicely. It's that when you feel like you are handed a heritage, that game existed long before you, and now you are, lucky or fortunate to be part of it, and then you're gonna pass it forward to future generations and to new players, and you can hope that whatever that short period of time you are participating in this game will allow you to pass it forward in a better shape, right? Like the tradition will be enriched and not impoverished through your participation. And that's like feeling of respect for the game. That's what we have to hope to imbue in PhD students, and that's what kind of researchers we would like to raise, and we want to make their number higher if we can. And then we can't. No, 100% of people will never be like this. Human beings are complex, there are other forces at play, there are other interests at play, etc. And it's just how do we go about this battle, and how do we ensure that more people are not hypocritical but genuinely try to enact the values behind that are standing behind our profession. And here I think, yes, different methods can be used. I think the most fundamental one, no matter what, is that education during PhD programs, but even earlier. And like if someone read the Glass-Beats game, that's a very relevant book for the current discussion about academia being like an ivory tower. And the main, well, a spoiler alert, like the main hero in the end of the book, he quits the ivory tower of academia and he goes to become like a babysitter for a 3-year-old boy, because he understands that that's where he can make an impact to a 3-year-old boy. So like even like the early stages, right? It's even through incorporating it through school education about how do we explore the world and how we know what we know about the world, right? To make those values, familiar to people and understandable to people. And that's the most profound solution. But I also acknowledge that on a more shallow level, we can have those, changes in practices. But just we must be very, very careful when we are doing it, because we don't know once we poke the bear what else is going to change, what are unintended and unanticipated consequences which can transpire as a result.
Indeed. As much as not doing anything is also a choice.
Yeah.
No, we must be doing something, because it's that thing, if we do nothing, then bad guys will take over. So we have to have the fight, we have to keep protecting the values of profession. They're not gonna protect themselves. I think the scariest thing is the Hugh Heckler book is at 2008, so it's before Trump. But I think the Trump example really shows what is the opposite of thinking institutionally very well. It's like, you have this group of people who are genuinely following the values of the profession. Now you have other people who who actually driven by something else, but they are within institutions, so they have to pretend that they also share those values, because otherwise they can't just get away with doing like whatever they are doing. And then there is like this ultimate extreme when people stop even pretending, like they stop caring about the values so much so they don't even pretend, and that's Trump. Yeah, so we don't want that to happen. Yeah, we need people who are genuinely fight for the values of academia, so that others have to pretend that they do. And I'm talking about it, I might sound like an idealist, but I'm actually being very cynical here. I just believe that any system we impose, if someone wants to cheat, someone will cheat. That's the thing. So that's why it's only through this more fundamental change, like Jiddu Krishnamurti calls it an internal revolution. That's what we need, internal revolution.
Okay, thank you. Saran?
Very Nietzschean.
Yeah, so whenever I come across this question, because this comes up all the time, certainly with the research I'm doing on responsible research and innovation from an SDS perspective, it's a really scary question because when you think about all of the different things you might have to do to handle, on the individual level, or do you try and push institutions, whose responsibility is it? It's a scary question because we all have different elements of this responsibility. One thing that I think is really cool, and Dr. Siracheva is very focused on being, critical and starting the discourse, but I want to be a little bit optimistic for a minute because for the last sort of 5 or so years, I've been studying the open science and the science reform community. I've been analysing their practices. I've been analysing, the movement as a social movement. And one thing that really excites me is the fact that within this community, there are people who are focusing on the individual. There are people who are focusing on community. There are people who are focusing on dismantling the institution. There are people who are starting and tackling education and problems in education. I can name, just off the top of my head, a dozen different groups from grassroots to the very top funders who are targeting different elements of the bigger problem, right? Because the whole system has to change. That traditional academic system from which the science reform community has emerged, that whole system is toxic and problematic, and it needs to be dismantled on every level, right? But again, that is a huge responsibility for a single researcher. And so what I would say to people who are listening, who are thinking, okay, all of this discussion about higher level stuff is great, but what can I do? Where is my place? And how do I find what I'm supposed to be doing in practice, right? Because this is hard. I would say to find your people, and within those people, find your niche. So if you're really worried about education and how education and training and practice don't always go hand in hand, take a look at getting involved in, say, FORT, who are a group who are really focused on, from a grassroots level, they're really focused on education and bringing open science and science reform to education. If you're interested in dismantling publishing, if you're interested in publishing reform, there are loads of different platforms. I'm part of one of them who were just really interested in just getting into that system and fucking it all up. Sorry, I probably shouldn't say that, but so excellent, good, because I just did. But my point is just find what really gets you turned on, what really sets you on fire in terms of reform, and focus on that. Don't be freaked out, because again, I still get like that. I hear, oh, where do I start? There's so much that needs to be fixed. There's so much wrong. Find what really gets you and focus on that, because I can tell you there are 100 other people who are focused on that with you or more. And there are 100 other people who are focused on a different element of the problem. So don't feel that responsibility too heavily. Just focus on what you're good at, what you're interested in, and where you can help the most.
Yeah, thank you, because this allows me to plug the fact that we have an open science community here. So if you are if you're interested in this kind of conversations, please consider joining. It's called Open Science Community Rotterdam. You'll find it online. Anyway, sorry for the plug. I just had to. Dan?
Yeah.
Can you ask, by the way, how open is it? Is it only Rotterdam?
Well, there's a whole ecosystem there.
There are heaps of them everywhere. Groningen, in Utrecht, in Amsterdam, everywhere.
We're also outside of the Netherlands. Now
Sweden,
we have
UK,
everywhere. Yeah, exactly. So Sweden, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Portugal, Serbia. So there's
Norway.
It's getting
Everywhere.
quite big. It is really open. We tend to practice what we preach. We do our best. Dan?
Yeah, I think I share your Shireen's optimism in that regard, because I feel that we have this particular mirage in academia or any type of institution that once we have learned to jump through the ropes and we get some type of tenure, or we rise in the organizational hierarchy, then we can enact the changes that we want to see. And I don't really believe that, because I think they construe you even more at that stage. So what I want to endeavor people people to think a little bit more about is, what is in your, individual sphere of influence and competence that may be your direct area, but maybe also the connections that reside outside of it, where you have this performative effect. So it's how you engage with your students, it's how you engage with your colleagues, how you engage in the research process, that you feel and think is right, because there's no ultimate truth out there that you're going to persuade anyone about. And that's the same with open science. But I think it's a wonderful philosophy to aspire to. Yeah.
I'll just say that, so I edit at 2 different journals, and I completely agree with you that it gets harder as you do more stuff and you get more senior to sort of, keep doing these things. But I think what you said earlier, it's about all these small choices that you make along the way. So as an editor, when I ask for reviewers, I'll email them not just saying, oh, you're an expert in this, blah, blah, blah. I'll say, I'm interested in your perspective on the conceptual level. I understand that you're not maybe necessarily familiar with simulations, but on a conceptual level, I think you can evaluate this paper. And being transparent about why I'm requesting them, I started a special issue at the Journal of Trial and Error that's focusing on interrogating the unintended consequences of the science reform movement, because I'm not into drinking the Kool-Aid. I want to think, okay, how does this practice affect people downstream? Traditional academia has all these moving parts. It's an enormous, complicated system. If we mess with this little one bit here, how does it affect the rest of the system? It's not free, right? So I completely agree, but I think because I see norms in academia changing on certainly lots of different levels to different extents, I think that it's more and more possible for us to sort of make good decisions, and I really hope so, because I'm about to start an assistant professorship. So I really hope that as I make my way up, and you can speak to this as well, that it's possible to hold on to these good values and to continue these practices. I really hope so.
But can I add a little bit to that? Because I feel like we're talking a lot about different ways of tackling this, and now we kind of have this individualized approach where we're trying to account for individual choices that may compound into collective or systemic effects. But I think it's very important if we're talking about unintended consequences and other feedback loops. This reminds me of Wicked Problems. Rittel and Weber, a very old article. Then my question really becomes, what is the problem definition? What's the problem that we're talking about? Because that's going to help us decipher what the individual action should be towards potential solutions. And I think we've kind of jumped over this in our little panel. But
I'm not sure we'll get there.
Yeah, no, this I understand. It is also an evaluative problem, but you need some type of, at least a dot on the horizon or something that sufficient, ambiguous enough, but at least, what is it that we want to do with open science,
I think better science is my start point personally. I know, as you say, each one has, the different sort of perspectives. For me, it's better, but better than what was. That's very, very ambiguous, I know. But if I try my best to teach people, to mentor people, in my roles in the academic system, because I nearly left academia because I didn't think I could deal with all this shit. I didn't know that I could handle it. I didn't know that the system wouldn't mess me up too. So for me, it's just better. And how can I be honest and open in the process of making it better for people I teach, for people I mentor, for my colleagues, and just a little bit better than when I started. That's for me a start point.
So before I ask Maria Carmen, I just want to say that very often we talk about the fact that, enacting change on a particular aspect of a very complex system doesn't really allow us to know what's going to happen afterwards, which is very true. As much as it's true that if we keep the situation as it is, we already know the kind of consequences that may occur. For example, like a few years ago, there was on Nature, there were the results of this survey that showed how around 30% of surveyed respondents in academia suffered from anxiety disorders and other, mental health issues, which is 3 times higher than the general population. We talk about brain drain. We're talking about things that this current system we know has created. So while on one hand I completely agree, we need to be wary about all the changes that we're trying to make. I am not really sure that it would get any worse than what it is happening now. Before I come to the audience, Maria Carmen,
I think maybe then just a small point. I think it's a way to also reimagine what researchers do in the world and what kind of life they lead and what kind of things they can aspire to be. Because I also would like to, for us to think about how can this benefit us, right? And I mean, personally, and I can say this quite quickly, like I have also doubted, is academia for now the place for me? And the only way I manage to exist in it is by finding my own way around it.
Same.
And I think this is a bit of a similar approach. It's not super straightforward, of course, because it means, maybe applying for jobs where people that evaluate you don't have the same framework in mind. So that's also where I think that the responsibility of institutions start. And I like that one of the key papers about open science that you shared with us is when talking about reflexivity, we were talking about basically like a decolonial approach and also declaring who are you in society. And again, it goes back to the power. Who's evaluating us? Who's hiring us? And what groups do they belong to? And I think the problem with the fact that open science, the way people react to it is also because it will show the lack of diversity, actually. And it will show who is behind these papers. And I put myself in it because I basically belong to any privileged group that you can imagine, except for men. But that's so in that sense, I think that's why it stirs so much. But I do think that that's where institutions' accountability also should come in.
Can I express my confusion here? Because I'm feeling like I'm being lost in the discussion, like back to the square one, which was the open sciences. So I totally see this, I totally understand the concerns you are expressing. I just don't see how we think that open science is the solution to those concerns. Like the fact that researchers experience more anxiety than some other groups of people. Like the fact that there are all those, injustices in the society. I think when we talk about open science, we're mostly talking about like what an individual researcher is supposed to do. Be more open, be more responsible, be more honest. Like I don't see how, maybe I'm being lost, but what are those practices we are talking about which actually gonna change the way reviewers review my paper?
But that's why I'm saying that open science, for me, it's about so much more. It's about dismantling this entire toxic system that engenders these problems. So changing publishing, changing what a successful researcher is actually defined as, changing how funding is given out, instead of having the traditional way, using, for example, a narrative CV. Not that I necessarily agree with those, but so it's about all of these small changes on a systemic level to sort of dismantle this toxic academic structure. So that's why I say open science is a very small part of a very big puzzle, because it doesn't address these problems exactly. So it's about responsible research, it's about reform, which goes well beyond open science. But I'm starting to go on my soapbox, and I'm going to sit back down.
No, thanks. Just that, we are nearing the end, and there is at least one more question that I would like to ask to the panelists. But I have two questions from the audience.
I just want to reflect on something. You keep saying traditional academia. My question is then, how did we get here? And what is traditional? Because I do see that in the last 10 years, a lot has changed, or last maybe 20 years, 10 years, a lot has changed in the incentive systems in academia. We can all vouch for that. And I'm not saying that this is the solution or that's the only problem, but the tenure track criteria as they stand now, they were also, and that's where maybe your concern for going the wrong way is going as well, they were implemented, the tenure track system was implemented to push, to get also some bad things out of academia. People that were not doing that much research anymore, were just happy where they are, and the ambition was not there anymore. That's one of the reasons why the tenure track system was introduced. But with the tenure track system, other elements, other values were downgraded. We're not, and that's why we have this discussion. It's a discussion on which values should we prioritize, or should we reconsider our prioritization of values that we have in academia. And there, I'm wondering, although I hear it in all your stories, we're not talking here about the incentive systems that we have in place. How do we value good academic? What is a good academic? How do we evaluate academics? And how do we then incentivize these values? And sometimes it's as literal as you say, I'm joining a new job. How am I evaluated in my research? How am I evaluated in my education? We're not talking here yet about education, but that's as an activity. But also, how are we evaluated as a professional? And that judges us on what we do. And we can say, yes, it's about intrinsic motivation, it's about individual responsibility, but we also have to think about the extrinsic motivations here in the systems that push us in a certain direction. So.
If you want to add something, feel free. I'm going to get ready for the next question.
Hi. So when I hear the rhetoric of this whole system is toxic, I reject it outright because it's an extraordinary claim which requires extraordinary evidence. I don't see evidence that every single level of everything that is done in academia is in any way corrupted so poorly that it has to be completely dismantled, disintegrated. I don't see the power story, though there are elements of power. I don't see it as pervasive as is being portrayed at all. Quite to the contrary. I mean, I would say that, yeah, you do have senior people who get into a lot of trouble when they write bad papers because that gets rejected as well. It's not saying the system is perfect. There are imperfections within the system, but I don't hear any sort of dialogue about what can be done, which is well-grounded in a philosophy of science and understanding and reasoning beyond rhetoric about openness and accountability without actually pointing out, as Dan pointed out, to whom and why and where and what is science and what is this thing that we are trying to do. I mean, Chalmers asked this question, what is this thing called science? This is such an old question which remains unanswered to this day. Popper could not answer this question. The demarcation problem still continues to exist. And in 1963, he actually wrote that our education system and our colleges are so corrupted that we don't, corrupted in the sense of intellectually corrupted because we don't train our students, our doctoral students, to ask right questions. So they become nothing but technicians. And I see this in teaching doctoral students research methods programs, right? I teach that. So again, it's a very wicked problem, you're right. And it requires a lot of thinking. But for even those who consider themselves relatively open-minded about science, when you hear stuff like it's toxic, it smacks of ideology, it only turns people off. Yeah. I mean, and that's something which should be considered very strongly. Thank you.
Anyone would like?
I disagree, but we only have 8 minutes.
Yeah. No, I mean, my study of meta-science in the last 10 years has shown me a lot, and I guess I just see that there's so much toxicity that's come from it. And I don't think that it needs to be completely dismantled. If I did, I wouldn't still be able to be in academia. So I do think it can be changed from within, but I think it's a lot of work, and I do think there's a lot of toxicity. But it is indeed true that saying all of academia is toxic is a pretty broad claim, and I do retract that in the light of what you're saying. A lot has to change, though.
It's also an extraordinary claim to say that a certain set of people know better than everyone else, especially when those same set of people don't ground their arguments in philosophy, science, reasoning, and understanding. I haven't heard anything so far.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I understand your point. I think it also, I mean, this is just a small panel. I think this conversation is incredibly big and incredibly detailed and incredibly complex, and I'm sure that we can point out maybe not when we have like 6 minutes, we can point out to like good conversations that have been happening within, like the literature, within, like bibliometrics research, within sociology, this is not a problem. It is an extraordinary problem. I'm not sure it requires more extraordinary evidence that we already have.
Got a lot of evidence.
I think it's time to act. But I completely understand where you're coming from. I'm just sorry that we cannot continue this conversation in a more in a deeper way, because here is the last question before we wrap up. So we've talked a lot about the connection between qualitative research and open science, and in general the fact that open science is just science done right. So how can qualitative research be done right? Or is it like all is good, nothing to see here, it's fine? Or can open science as a thinking framework, not just a series of practices, but as a thinking framework, how can it help improve the quality of qualitative research? So what can be done, according to you, to improve practically qualitative research while thinking, broadly in an open science way. Saran, would you like to take this last question?
I don't think I have too much to add on top of what I already said, except for keeping the spirit of open science in mind. And I think this doesn't just apply to qualitative, of course, it applies to everyone who's doing some kind of research. But keeping the idea of transparency in mind, just because you can't necessarily replicate a qualitative research study, just because you can't share your data as much as you might be like, that doesn't mean that you can't conduct your research with an eye towards being open, being honest, and being transparent about what you're doing, because you're following a research method and you're able to describe that method, whether it's by including, and this is what I do, including reflexive notes as supplementary files. People probably won't read them, but the point is that they're there if they want to, and they're there if the need arises to be able to look at what I did. To keep notes on that kind of stuff is just one way that you can, again, work in the spirit of being open and honest and transparent. So that's all I would say, just to sort of keep that in mind, and that will direct a lot of what you do, even if you're not replicating or always doing all the open science things.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. So very practical. Anastasia.
I think I'm also going to be practical. So I think that a lot of subjects we touched upon today are actually beyond this conversation of what can I do as a qualitative researcher specifically, right? So those questions belonging to the domains of review processes and tenure track systems and publishing houses. So I think if we put those things aside, which are indeed very difficult institutional issues, so what can we do as qualitative researchers? I think that practically what we must do is improve our education systems so that we teach the future generations of scholars to do research in an honest way, to maximize the chances, increase the probability that they will do research in an honest way, and then teach them to write good papers about it. Such papers, like we have a lot of examples of beautifully written papers, like if you think in the field of management, Dutton and Duckeridge, 91, and New York Port Authority. There's no open science practices around it, but it's a beautiful paper. You read it and you know it. You read it and the theory that they generate is important, and the way they report it. So teach to do honest research and teach to write papers which can express it very well, can persuade the readers, right? And how do we do it? Start with philosophy of science training, education, and I would say introduce, make people read classics, make people read the work of those who really moved the field forward before.
Yeah.
Okay. Dan?
How long do we still have?
1.5 minutes.
45 seconds.
Yeah, okay.
But no pressure.
No, I think I want to add to Bex Hewitt's comment. She's not here anymore, but she's like, she expanded on like, okay, it's very good if quantitative scholars are also aware about what's being discussed by qualitative scholars in relation to open science or better science. I think I would generally invite the entire public sector here and everyone, because I think once we have all these people in the room, I think our conversation is going to change a little bit, because we're having such an echo chamber, and I think we're not getting out of this. And the only way to get out of it, if we have people in the room where we have to explain what science actually is and does, then we're also adjusting. I think we can calibrate our expectations much better there, and also think a little bit more about practical implementations, because we're not. I think this is just like an endless conversation that we can continue to have, which is theoretically super fascinating, but it's empirically it's going to be very difficult to get out of it. That's it.
Okay. Maria Carmen?
I think to close, I think to Anastasia and to Dan's point, I think just practicing in more, so doing more science. I think doing smaller projects more often, so that you also learn how to do it, and teaching students as well, not only PhDs, but also I can tell that students are interested in how do you do research. Yeah. And sometimes we're also not even able to explain to them because it's so complex. And so maybe talking more about what do we do when we do science, and doing it a bit more often, and maybe with smaller projects that don't take 2.5 years. maybe it's a way to also get more acquainted with what it means to study the process and also be transparent about the process. Just do more science, I guess. Smaller, more science.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So time is up. It's 2.
Perfectly.
So I would like to thank everyone here in the audience who participated. I would like, of course, to thank the panelists. This was a fantastic conversation. I had a lot of fun. I hope you had too. And I would like to invite you to follow the next meetings that I mentioned at the beginning. And if you have any questions, you can just reach out to me, for example, or others in your school. There are data stewards that are very knowledgeable about open science. There are many people who are more and more interested in supporting you in your journey through openness and transparency. So thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you, Dr. Scatino.